Hi, everybody. I'm going to reintroduce Howard, as Bart said so. But Howard has a really long, interesting career, both in the public and private sector. As you can see from his shirt, he likes motorcycling. And if anybody read our last newsletter, you will see some pictures from a trip we had in Finland. So Howard's now become my boss, the chairman of the board of CodenomiCON. So welcome, Howard.
Thanks, David. Thanks, everybody. And I'm not going to do the podium thing, so if you would bear with me. But I would like a picture of you with your victory shirt, me, my Harley, and we'll take over the world.
Sounds good.
There was a Ducati person. Where is she? She was...
I drive a victory.
Anyway, thanks. It's great to be here. And David, thanks to you. David, we hired when I got on the board of CodenomiCON a number of years ago. And it was one of those CEO searches like we normally have and go through a bunch of really boring meetings until we met David, and it was really cool after that. So thank you for what you're doing and all the team from CodenomiCON and everything that you guys have done. Somewhere up there was a picture of how I first found out about CodenomiCON, and it wasn't actually, the company wasn't there yet. Ari, where are you, RIT? We're here somewhere. There he is. So this picture, which should be up there if technology worked like it should, or whoever's zapping the signal, there it is. That was February of 2002, a few months after September 11th. And some of you here probably remember a week after 9/11 of 2001, we got hit by NIMDA. To this day, I still don't know who it was, why it was, but it was. And the president appointed a couple of us to be cyber advisors, which is really cool, being the only geek in the White House, which was a real challenge. But we got an alert one day from the CERT Coordinating Center at Carnegie Mellon that said University of Oulu had done some research and found a vulnerability in the way encoding was done on ASN1. And if you're not familiar with that, effectively it's every piece of communications in the world, air-to-ground communication. This was like a month before the United States and all the coalition partners started searching for Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan. And so we were in there, and of course we got the president. The legs you see are Condoleezza Rice. Tom Ridge is the guy facing on the side, Dick Clark. And that's when I had hair and a mustache, so I still had a life at that point. And trying to brief the president about a vulnerability that unto itself, even good security people that aren't application security related may have a problem understanding it. Trying to get this gentleman understanding not only what software was, but also the vulnerabilities. So that's when we first came in contact with CodenomiCON. A few years later, I got a call from the former CEO that said, listen, we'd like to talk to you. And it was then we connected the dots that basically the same research that Ari and the team did out of Oulu were the same company that's here today. So that's sort of the background on it. Billy, you're still here? Your presentation from a few moments ago. I really appreciate the presentation, particularly the plight of calling DHS and saying, hey, can you put us in contact with somebody, and then calling a receptionist. The thing that I'm really surprised about, they even knew that they had a security team in the companies. We rarely see that. So anyway, I just want to take a few minutes and talk about something that's going on today, and then I'd like to have the discussion the best I can with you before we all hit the bar and all the other parties that are out here. A lot of discussion recently about the sale of vulnerabilities. And it's interesting because those of us that were doing this stuff 15, 20 years ago, we remember the days where somebody discovered vulnerability and it was like, get to wave the biggest flag and hey, we identified some vulnerabilities. We got some good technology, particularly from as we evolved into layer 6, layer 7 security issues that most people weren't paying attention to be able to actually move forward with something like that. And then, of course, the next thing was what we saw when I was at Microsoft, Marianne Davidson from Oracle and a bunch of us saw at that point was good researchers going out and said, hey, we can monetize this. Instead of living in my parents' basement as a researcher, I can actually get my own place by selling the work that I do and the research that I do to companies. Unfortunately, what we saw on the first tranche of that is a lot of the companies really got upset about it. I was at Microsoft. I told the story to a colleague this morning about the first time we got a call from NGS that said, hey, we found these vulnerabilities and we'll give them to you, but we want to hire you to do other stuff. It's like, there's no way in the world we're going to pay for this stuff. But then eventually we recognized that we just didn't have the bandwidth, we didn't have the technical capabilities, we didn't have the external viewpoint, and I think a lot of us look at that. You develop a chunk of software and you're trying to develop it tight, you're trying to develop small and to do all kinds of things, and security oftentimes is not the piece you're concerned about. So when somebody says go back and check this, they're generally not as open as they would to finding their own mistakes. So we found real value in doing that. And then sort of the next evolution of this, which once again, many of us in this room know about, but the public doesn't know about, we start to see a lot of this stuff come up for auctions. Some of you might remember the sites were out there. You could actually go bid on a vulnerability, hoping that the vulnerability you're bidding on is really, really real. So you're not paying your money and get something that was a buffer overrun from 6 months ago, but the bottom line is that was the next evolution of it. So a lot of thing in the news recently about selling vulnerabilities to governments. Was interesting on Billy's slide. I didn't know if you noticed that, but he was talking some different services. One of them was Prism 1, 3, and 5 or something like that. Made me wonder, was that the NSA Prism or was that another Prism that was up there? But we're seeing an awful lot where there's discussions about governments buying 0 days, put them on the shelf so they can use them at some point. And when we look at what's going in the world today, particularly Charlie and the rest of the guys that depend on cyber weaponization, it really resonated because we have 27 some odd nations now that have determined that they need a cyber command, if you would. Part of the cyber command is creating offensive weapons. And offensive in our word means, creating malware. Finding 0 days, ways to exploit stuff, to be disruptive. And if you indeed even buy into the fact that that's necessary and important, which I think a lot of us disagree with it, but if you agree that it's necessary, how do you deal with the nations that don't have structure, that don't have a process? That their testing is somebody throwing a laptop on a network and saying, oh, go test this out. And next thing you're tipping over the TLDs all around the world because somebody found a 0 day that affects the DNS system. So when you start looking at that, so people are shelving those things. We're seeing incidents where other people are saying, fine, I'll use this, use it for competitive intelligence gathering, intellectual property theft. So there's some real questions about, is this indeed ethical and the right thing to do? And for those of us that have long fought for transparency and responsible disclosure and actually holding people accountable for what they do and doing it in a very ethical manner, it's like, okay, well, we're not really in favor of a lot of these things. But you can't take that monetization out of it. I mean, there was money to be made in that. And so a lot of the questions that I think we get is, well, how do you change it? How do you stop it? And the answer is pretty simple. You just start creating firmware, hardware, software, embedded devices that have less vulnerabilities. If you have less vulnerabilities, that makes, of course, all of our lives easier, but it also then sort of takes out the financial benefit of nation states stockpiling cyber weapons, as the previous panel was talking about, and people trying to do one-upmanship on it. Now, I guess even though the years some of us have been doing this, I still remain the eternal optimist that someday we actually get better at it. You look at some of the things we've seen from the work in the open source community, you look at what some of the commercial companies are doing, and you look at least some of the big ticket vulnerabilities that have existed. They're doing a better job to making sure that they're not in the products, making tremendous investments. I don't think David mentioned, but one of my things that I do is I'm executive director of a nonprofit called Safe Code, the software assurance for Forum for Excellence in Code. Sounds a big funny name, but the bottom line is Microsoft, Adobe, Siemens, SAP, CA, Intel, EMC, a lot of the companies have got together and said, listen, why are we doing training for our application development teams, trying to teach them how to write secure code when we can share this? And one of the things we did recently was using all those experts from the different companies. And we all recognize that within companies you have pockets of excellence. You have others that oftentimes you're really stressed to get somebody to pay attention. But being able to take that, turning it into some training so others can use it for free. So you don't have to be a multi-billion-dollar global company to go out there and actually be able to train people how to write secure code. How do you wind up determining what are the compilers you need to use? How do you, once the final bits have been compiled, how do you do testing on that, such as with fuzzing and things? So there's a lot of components that we've got to do yet. So my optimism comes in the front. We take this serious. I mean, you all on the front lines, you do this on a day-to-day basis. You make sure it works. And every time I have some, and I'll try to be as polite as possible, is some government wonk tell me that, things are bad and the world's falling apart. I think back to what it would have been 20 years ago had we not done what we've done to point and what we're doing in the future, the investment we're making. So we really need to, the optimism comes from the fact that we are doing better. We're better now than we were last year. We presumably will be better next year. The threat's up higher more than ever. We have more people that are finding tools, capabilities, training to research the very vulnerabilities that we know about. But the bottom line is people are taking it more serious. And I think one of the goals that some of us have is, while we in the technology field get it, and we have to overcome sort of, in many cases, the business units that say, yeah, fine, I'm glad you want to spend another 2 weeks doing some fuzzing of this particular thing, but we've got a product ship date, we've got it done, they have all the pretty little boxes made up already, so forget that, we'll do it later on, and we know that's not the way to run a business. And so some of the things we're working on is getting the executives, getting the board of directors to say, you have to support the security people that are making the company successful, that are making you money, that are keeping things from breaking. And unfortunately, you're the people that are in the closet, wiring closet at 2 o'clock in the morning trying to figure out what in the hell is going on. So those are just some of the constant things. I'm not going to bore you with details about governments and government programs, because it's interesting when you look at some of those, they're not really cybersecurity, they're policy and pieces of privacy that we've not paid a lot of attention to. But the main thing I wanted to get in the 10 minutes I've got before we do the Q&A is let you know a little bit of the history, some of the things we're seeing, some of the things that we as a community have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, and hopefully looking for a way forward. So I thank you not only as a technologist, but also somebody that so embedded with everything that we love and that we work for. Thank you for everything you're doing, because next year when we get together, hopefully we'll look back at all this silliness that's going on now and said, yeah, we fixed it since then, and we'll continue to move forward. So with that, thanks again. I'd love to have any questions. We have, if I don't know the answer, which is always likely, we have some really smart people in the room that may not have been up on the stage that have an opportunity to chime in as well. So thank you, and questions.
Thanks, Howard. So we got Manny over here with the microphone.
Anybody but Manny can, no.
And I'm over here with it. So now's your time to ask questions. Raise your hands and we'll get through it. Who's got a question?
Yeah, go ahead, brother.
So a question, it seemed to be somewhat corroborated from the Obama White House, and you may have more insight into this. Did things really go down the way with Stuxnet that were reported, that there was this call made and President said, do I have any other options that are not kind of kinetic that are going to happen from Israel? And he said, and it was told to him, yeah, we have this other thing we can do.
Yeah, and the answer to the question is I don't know because that predated my getting there. But one of the things that I wrestled with all the time, so my role was dual-hatted. So I had the national security piece, which was pretty easy for people to understand, but I also had the national economic piece. But there was a very deliberate, and I was told that you're not in this space of it, you're not in the offensive side, you're not in that piece of it, you're about defending things. Now, having said that, I found it interesting as the reports come out that I've heard discussions where people would say that. Here's the choices. Either you blow shit up, or blew stuff up, sorry, or you use something that's more technology related, and we always justify it. The problem is that it may seem justifiable today, but when we look back 10 years from now and see that Pandora's box that we've opened up, will we be able to look back and say, that was the right thing to do 10 years ago, irrespective of who actually did the coding and deploying and all that other stuff. And if you look at the history of nations particularly, and the policies and decisions that people have made, look back to the previous wars that we've had, look at the previous things that have taken place, and you go back, there's no way in the world we'd ever do that today. So will we be saying this 5-10 years down the road? But more importantly, the vulnerability should have never existed that people would get away with that crap. Yes, sir.
I've been hearing a lot in the news about potential backdoors in silicon. Could you talk about that point and how prevalent it might be?
Yeah, and that's always one of the concerns. And I don't know of any reported cases where somebody's found something that was deliberately put there, but there's always a lot of discussions. That goes to that whole supply chain risk thing that we talk about. So and take any device, even something like a mobile device or we have the iPad there. Yeah, an iPad, and just look at the board layout on that. And I remember back in my younger days, the ham radio, I used to actually build my own circuits on pegboard and stuff. But you think of the complexity on there and try to find not only something that shouldn't be there, but find something that's actually built into the silicon that basically shouldn't be there, that is not beaconing, which is not sitting there in a line of code you can reverse engineer and say, yes, I see this out there and it's due to do this. It's just sitting out there. So it's valid. I think there's been some testing done that shows that's a possibility, but how you find it escapes most of us, which goes back to some of the things I think this community needs to do is actually try to figure out a way to identify as something that shouldn't be there, not only from the physical layer, but also from the electronic layer as well. I don't think any of us can burn a double E problem that's really going to do some weird stuff that's not, I mean, not to drag this on, but a BIOS is a typical example of that. I mean, I can throw some stuff on a BIOS, or anybody in this room can throw stuff on a BIOS that you will never ever see until you're ready to see it.
What do you see as the potential tipping point for when it's no longer just a small group of people here in Las Vegas that need to get together to talk about things, and it just becomes part of our development society?
Yeah. And the front end, the first few words you missed was when it was the tipping point. Where is the time in that? That time passed a long time ago. I mean, we should have been doing the stuff we're doing now 10 years ago. And there were many of us that were doing it 10 years ago. Ari, if you're still around, there you are. I mean, guys like him and guys like David Litchfield, and people were doing this 10 years ago. And yet here we are, years later, still having a similar discussion, still trying to relearn the same things that we were teaching 10 years ago. But and I get asked all the time, you know, people were preaching this even 20 years ago. Because although most people think the internet is now 20 years old with the advent of the World Wide Web and HTML and all that other stuff, I mean, back in the early days of SMTP, when we found the first buffer overrun, and it was probably late 80s, I think is when we found that, it was like, we need to fix this now. And we didn't have anywhere near the dependency or the criticality. So we're way past that tipping point. The question is how do we do it? I'm sorry.
And even furthermore, curriculum in schools aren't reflecting this need for our industries. And how are we going to further and change that so that a C++ class isn't not just talking about making functionality, but also limiting vulnerabilities?
Well, you look at C++, you look at C#, you look at any of the languages like that, and even if we teach the right things in there, somebody grabs a library that's got 14 vulnerabilities, compiles it, and we're still screwed. But you're absolutely right. So two points on that. One of the things, and the U.S. government works at government speed, not internet speed. So we actually had a program that I started when I was there called NICE, the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education. You know, we always use these nice acronyms and buzzwords. But the intent was not only do end user education awareness for consumers and old people and all that other stuff, but also get this baked into curriculums. So let me ask you real quick, how many here have computer science degrees? Maybe a third of the room. And you start looking at the people that are really good at this. Some have computer science degrees. Others have no degrees that have been sitting there in coding since they were a teenager. So getting that into the formal education to teach us not only how to write cool code and rich, robust code, but how to do it securely is something we desperately need. So through this NICE program was twofold, getting it baked into the universities, and not just in the United States, but globally. But at the same token, make sure that we've got workforce development, so when one of you, if you ever need to look for a job, says, here's my resume and here's what I do, and by the way, this translates into the equivalent of a computer science degree / security or / secure coding or / network security. We're just not there, and it's really tough getting the universities to adjust the curriculum. I'm a professor at Idaho State, a professor of research at Idaho State University, which has a really, really good program on the National Initiative for Cybersecurity Education, but basically trying to get somebody in the computer science side, which is not part of our center. It's like, yeah, I don't need to do that. I teach people how to, write code, and that's all we do. So it's a problem. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Howard, I'm standing here next to my good friend Mark Milatovich, who introduced me to a really great book. It's called In Athena's Camp, and it talks about the changing face of war. And it goes into great detail about how technology is completely changing the way wars are going to be fought in the future. And when I read it, what was really interesting is that it was written in the 1990s. So as I sit here today, the thing that really concerns me is that we work with various government agencies, and many of them are interested in our tools, right, but can't purchase our tools because of sequestration. How do we get the government, military spending, to understand that this almost limitless budget we have for weapons should be applied towards cyber security tools and training? Like they canceled the ICSJWG, a great working group in the DHS, which had training exercises. They just announced that the red team exercises are being canceled. Why cancel that and not cancel boot camps in the military? What is it going to do to really, really, truly get the government to take this seriously?
So there's a few things. I guess I probably fall in the camp that I'm never going to wake up in the morning depending on the government to do something that I need to have done that benefits all of us. I've seen too many politicians sway things and all that silliness there. So the idea that somehow the government's going to rescue this is flawed. Second thing, when you look at, and sequestration, of course, is a U.S. problem, but I see a lot of other nations that don't have a lot of money to spend on a lot of different things. It goes back to who's actually creating the technology. We are in private sector. Who is deploying the products? Who's actually securing the products? It's us. The government, in some cases, gets in the way with stupid regulations. Other times, they can be helpful, particularly from a law enforcement perspective, if they operate within constitutional bounds in the United States. But it's a problem. The third thing, when you start looking at the overarching, going back to the really cool panel early on weaponization. And if this sounds silly, I'm sorry, but I'm going to say it anyway. So when I get bored, I have this, one of my many docs I read is The Art of War by Sun Tzu. Some of you may have heard of it or not. It was written back in, 5th century, 6th century BC. So it's really cool, and they teach it in a lot of military schools and everything else. But what I do when I read it is not read it because somebody's going to, do bombing or whatever. I read it and try to do some correlation between the world we live in today. And there was one passage I read about a year and a half ago that said, it talked about use of fire in conflict. And the idea was that basically if you have to burn something to keep the enemy from getting it, it's a good thing. Well, I guess that is unless you're the farmer that you just burned their field. But when you start thinking of the way, and I'm paraphrasing this, it said, it's okay to use fire against an enemy if some conditions exist. If, number one, the wind's not blowing it back in your face. Guess that makes pretty good sense. The second condition that must exist, if it is indeed blowing back in your face, then whatever you have is not flammable. And the third condition exists if it's blowing back at you and what you have is not flammable, is flammable, then you better not care about it. And it goes back to the questions about cyber weapons and technology that can be used to cause disruption in some cases, like the medical devices some of us talked about, that can actually cause major serious harm or even death to people. So if you want to deploy that, you better make sure it's not going to be used against you. And how do we do that? I mean, it blows back on every time somebody tries to do it. And that's the ones that we think we know about. The second condition is if indeed it comes back and exploits a vulnerability you've got, you better not have the vulnerability, but if you do, you better not care about it. And when you think about everything we depend on today, I mean, how many vulnerabilities out there actually do have the ability to be disruptive to our lives? And there's no shortage of people who will be willing to exploit them either. So it's not as simple as just saying, spend more money, government create more bad things to happen because we're the ones that stuck in the middle between two nations being pissed off or two being angry at each other. So I'm just normal environment here. But that's a bad thing for people all around. Yes, sir. There's a mic coming, please.
In talking about these kinds of things where you're allocating money here and there, or there are politicians making decisions about how to deploy some of these weaponized exploits, how do you explain the ramifications of using this kind of software to people who, to a man, are not technical and who come up with gems like series of tubes because they just don't know any better? How do you deal with something like that?
You saw the picture up there in the beginning?
Yes.
I mean, that's exactly the case that you've stated. Okay. And what's even more difficult is even if you have a good rational business case and you dumb it down, for lack of a better word, so something that non-technical politicians can understand, then you've got another group of people where they're spending hundreds of $millions lobbying to get them not to make the right decision. And I wish I had an answer for your question, but I don't. I mean, I've sat up there and sit there in front of people at Congress, both in the Senate and the House. I've met with members of Parliament from different countries around the world and said, listen, I don't care what this person is telling you that this is a good thing and you should be doing it. Here's the reality of your actions. And they go, thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. Their eyes glass over, non-technical, and then they go out and steal whoever's paying for their re-election. And I know it sounds cynical, because I am cynical, because I've seen it way too often. And so that goes back to not minimize them, because we can't ignore them, because they will create laws and do all kinds of things like we've seen governments do. But if we in private sector actually do the things that we need to do, it gives them no argument. It gives them no case to say, well, we need to go out and regulate, or we need to go out and create new cyber weapons because we have all these vulnerabilities. We don't get them. They've got nothing to gripe about. Then you go in and bother somebody else. Go, no offense to anybody who's ever been a farmer, go bother somebody in raising cows and stuff like that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other? Great. Well, once again, thanks to all of you. There's one last photo, which is, if we've got it up there. So when we talk about the medical device, we talk about all the other things, and I'm sure it's the same with the victories. I went in about a year and a half ago to get my motorcycle tuned up, and growing up in a world where fast cars and motorcycles have been my life, I went in, took it to a non-motorcycle dealership and said, I think it's missing, can you do something? Not that one.
Oh,
there you
there
go. The guy said, I can't do a thing for you. because the ECM, the electronic control module, controls everything, air fuel mixture, compression, and everything else. And I think the Victories and a lot of the modern day bikes are the same thing. So now I've got one where I actually can configure it myself. I connect it to my laptop and I can say I want to go faster next week or I want better fuel mileage and do it myself. And this way, if that breaks down, I'm really, really going to be upset. Anyway, thank you once again very much, and thanks for all you guys.